And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and this is our live coverage of the 15th Annual Annapolis Book Festival. Beginning now, former NSA and CIA Director Michael Hayden discussing terrorism and intelligence.
Welcome today to this event at the Key School in Annapolis at the Annapolis Book Festival. My name is Stephen Raggi. I'm a Key School parent with two sons who graduated 4 years ago, and I also am a professor at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, where I teach courses in international relations and ethics and international affairs. It's a great thing to have General Michael Hayden with us here today to talk about his 41-year career in the Air Force and in the national intelligence and national security area, and to talk to us about his book, Playing to the Edge, American Intelligence in the Age of Terror. The title, Playing to the Edge, is a kind of a sports metaphor, I think. It's like pushing the envelope or playing right to the edge of the field with chalk on your cleats. And it's appropriate that General Hayden would use sports metaphors, since I think you practically were born in the shadow of the Pittsburgh Steelers' Heinz Stadium.
Yeah, actually, they tore down my boyhood home to build Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh.
All right, all right.
And we didn't mind, because it was for the Steelers, which is a modestly dangerous comment to this group, I think.
That's quite possibly true. He was born in Pittsburgh, of Irish Catholic family, and the son of a welder. In junior high school, he was quarterback of his football team, and the coach of his football team then was the son of the founder of the Steelers. So the connection with this team goes way back, and I think there's actually a road now along the side of the stadium called Michael Hayden Road, Boulevard. And he was equipment manager. He was working the sidelines for the Steelers when he was in college at Duquesne and doing Air Force ROTC at University of Pittsburgh, and then also went ahead and got his MA in American history from Duquesne. St. Peter's Elementary School and North Catholic High School figured large in his upbringing, and he makes it clear in this very candid and personal memoir how much his young education really mattered to him. He says towards the end of the book, the further I got in my career, the more I realized the basics mattered. And so here we are at a school, and this book has a lot to say, actually, about the importance of education at that age. And I understand you still get up early on a Sunday in the fall.
Yep.
Go to very early Mass, drive to Pittsburgh, go to the game, drive home.
I do. Yeah.
Great. So you must have been a lieutenant or a captain just maybe 8 years into your career when a major event for the intelligence community was underway. And I'm talking about the Church and Pike hearings into the behavior of the CIA and the FBI, which took place in 1975. How were those important to your career?
So, I was, at a point in my career, I was on Guam, all right, and a junior officer, and frankly, I'd gotten on Guam in '72. Think back at the time as B-52 operations over Southeast Asia, so I very, very tactically focused. So all these things going on in Washington, made the headlines of the Stars and Stripes, but didn't affect me personally, and I didn't dig into them very much. But Steve and I were talking before we came in, but I certainly learned the fine print of everything that came out of Church Pike in the 1970s, because that was the structure that we had then decided that would be used to govern the American intelligence community. And it is just very briefly, pre-75, it wasn't so much that the agencies were breaking the law. It was more that the law hadn't paid any attention to the agencies. There wasn't a clear code of thou shalt and thou shalt not. And then it just kind of flowed back and forth without the kind of clear distinctions that you need to have in an enterprise that, frankly, is so large, so powerful, and so secretive. And I hope we get to this later, Stephen, but one of the things I've learned is that church pike architecture that we then decided we would use to govern American espionage is now itself eroding. It now itself is looking insufficient to an awful lot of Americans in terms of governing what it is we do, which is one of the things I suggest in the book as what now in terms of going forward.
On August 17th in 1975, Senator Frank Church appeared on NBC on Meet the Press to give kind of a summary of what his committee had discovered. He was a political actor at that point. He was definitely planning to run for president until cancer terminated his candidacy, and he made space for Jimmy Carter, frankly. And he said, discussing the NSA, which General Hayden later ran from 1999 to 2005, he said, without mentioning the NSA by name, in the need to develop a capacity to know what potential enemies are doing, the United States government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. It's kind of touching. He talks about how they could even intercept telegrams. It's gotten more sophisticated then. He says, now, it's necessary and important that the United States look abroad at enemies or potential enemies. We must know at the same time that capability at any time could be turned around on the American people. And no American would have any privacy left, such as the capability to monitor everything. Telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide. And then he goes ahead and says, if this government ever became a tyranny, if an authoritarian ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there would be no way to fight back because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know. Such is the capability of this technology. I don't ever want to see this country go across that bridge. I know the capacity that is there could make total tyranny in America. And we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision so that we never cross over that abyss. I quote at length from Senator Church because I think it sums up General Hayden's career, that he was working at many levels, including the topmost, to make sure that this technology operate within the law, to quote Church again, and under proper supervision, so we never cross over that abyss. So your job was to make sure that what Church said never happened.
Right.
But over time, the capabilities obviously grew and the possibilities increased.
Yeah. So, wow, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me take it one at a time. One instance, it might be very, very revealing. So you got what Senator Church said, all right? I mean, so I was fond of saying when I worked up 97 here, all right, that NSA needed only two things to be successful. It needed to be secretive, and it needed to be powerful. And we exist in a political culture that frankly just trusts only two things: secrecy and power, all right? And so you've got this unnatural position inside of a Western democracy, but you do need what it is that NSA can offer. I mean, the trick is that it's pointed towards the nation's adversaries, and oh, by the way, it's foreign adversaries, all right, and has never turned inward against the American people, threatening its liberties. Now, that's pretty nice. That's a nice dichotomy. That's almost Manichaean, right? Okay, point it over there, don't point it over there. So that, for example, when we were flooding the zone against the communications, say, of the Soviet Union, all right? And let me just take a specific example. Let's use Soviet SRF, Strategic Rocket Forces. They have their big headquarters in Moscow, and of course, they've got to communicate to their ICBM fields out beyond the Urals on the steppes out there in Soviet Asia, right? We would monitor that network like nobody's business, as I am fond of saying, looking for words of interest in the communication, like launch, okay? And there isn't a civil libertarian or a senator who would ever lift a finger with regard to concerns about that. And what happened, which makes this more difficult than Senator Church and those folks in the 70s even imagined, by 2000, and I'm picking the date carefully, this is pre-9/11 stuff, all right? Okay, so prior to the terrorist attack and the kind of reshuffling of the balance of security, liberty, privacy, safety, and so on, I actually testified in open session down in front of the House Intel Committee. And the issue we had is that, again, no one paid any attention to us going after Strategic Rocket Forces Network. But if you wanted us to do for you in the 21st century what we had done for you in the 20th century, in this case, since there was no longer a Soviet Union, you were more concerned about terrorist communications, proliferator communications, the communications of transnational criminals, and so on. If you wanted us to go get them for you, and you did, and that was our job, what we said in 2000, April of 2000, in open session, what we said was, you realize those communications no longer exist in that other network over there. Those communications coexist with your Gmails. And they are skidding through those international pipes with your stuff right alongside of them. And so it's even more complex than Senator Church seemed to indicate, which was this kind of Manichaean world where looking here is good and looking there is bad. What I'm telling you is the stuff that used to be here is now here. And it's commingled with the things you still want us to go get. So it's even more difficult than Senator Church laid out. In other words, we had to go to you, frankly, that's why we were testifying, to get the money and in essence, the authority, small a, okay, the authority to go after these signals. And the only way we believed we could get that was to actually convince the Congress and indirectly you that even though your stuff would be skidding by, we wouldn't touch it, that we wouldn't grab it. So this is even more dramatic and more difficult, and in its own way, potentially more dangerous than what Senator Church tried to put out there as kind of a warning signal in the 1970s.
Now, you were in command at the NSA on September 11th, 2001.
Yeah.
How did you respond?
So went to work. It was a day like today, remember? I mean, it was clear. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was a Tuesday. I'd stayed up late watching Monday Night Football, came in, parked, went and got a haircut, came back, stopped at my ops center, just popped in. Anything on the scope? Anything happening? No, things were pretty normal. Thank you. Went to the office, and I began having my meetings. And as I was having one session, my executive assistant, Cindy Farkas, came in, said a plane hit one of the trade centers. And my reaction was probably like all yours. Gee, it must have been a small plane. How'd that happen? It's a pretty clear day. Went back to my meeting, and then she comes in with plane hit the other tower. And I immediately said, get the head of security up here. And as he was, a few minutes later, as he's coming through one door of my office, Cindy is coming through the other door saying there are reports of explosions on the mall. That's our mall downtown. And that's a garble of the plane hitting the Pentagon. And the chief of security is standing there, and he never said a word. I said, Kemp, all non-essential, out of here now. Tell them to evacuate. And then we decided, y'all been by Fort Meade. I mean, you live up here, you know what it looks like. We try to get everybody we could out of the 2 high-rises that you can see from 32, all right, and into that low rider that's a 3-story building that's near 32. You can see it's the old building. It's the original ops building, all right. So obvious reasons to get them out of the high-rises, get into the low rider. For my benefit, that's where our ops center was. So I mean, I had all the communications in the universe that I needed. And we just began to turn this massive SIGINT enterprise in the direction of this target, and we knew now this impending war. George Tenet called me about 10, a little bit later. I said, what do you got? And I said, George, it's Al-Qaeda. I mean, we all knew it was Al-Qaeda, but I said, George, it's Al-Qaeda. Their network's lighting up with the conversational equivalent of celebratory gunfire. You know, they're all kind of patting themselves on the back. Later that afternoon, early evening, again, remember how clear a day it was? Someone reminded me that our counterterrorism shop at Fort Meade, y'all know Fort Meade is kind of the headquarters of NSA. You probably know, but a lot of audiences don't, that it's also the biggest field station in NSA. I mean, it's just not managing the enterprise. It's actually about 50% of the enterprise, all right? And the other 50% is kind of everywhere else. One of the shops that was in one of the high-rises was the counterterrorism shop. And when I say counterterrorism shop, I don't mean, you know, filing the paperwork. I mean people with headsets on, all right, listening to intercept. Can't move them, all right? I mean, we can't stand the break-in mission. So we had to leave the counterterrorism shop in one of the high-rises. And just about dusk, someone reminded me they're still there. And so I went up and went in, and you could look through the windows at the kind of darkening sky. I had the thought, I couldn't, but if we were maybe just 8 or 9 stories higher, you could have seen Fort McHenry, which is the scene of the last bombardment of an American city. And there were people from our logistics force tacking up blackout curtains because, you know, they would have been obvious with the lights on and we couldn't evacuate them and so on. So I had the thought, this is weird. We're tacking up blackout curtains in Eastern Maryland in the 21st century. Things are going to be different. I walked around the room. Most of them were Arab American. They had the national trauma to deal with that we were all dealing with. They had the professional trauma to deal with. This was their job. And because they were Arab American, I think there was a little more even personal trauma for them, just given the nature of the attack. I didn't make any speeches. I just walked around, hand on shoulder, nod, hang in there, and so on. The agency turned on a dime. It's a very powerful, dedicated place, and they know what they're doing. And when we just, like I said, began to shift, okay, we're going over here, and we're going to focus on this target, it actually, in a very short period of time, began to produce things that became of great value, keeping you safe and making them feel unsafe. Now, you might ask, oh, that's good, Hayden. Why didn't you do it on September 9th or September 7th or September 5th? And the answer was, just very candidly, and I've talked about this in the book, because we had a variety of priorities. We had a lot of things that were competing for our attention. By the way, those ICBMs, they were still there. Okay, they were now under Russian control, not Soviet control. But I mean, immediately, 10:30 on that Tuesday morning, I didn't ask anybody's permission. I just started moving chips as quickly as I could.
And one of the things that came out of one of the great new initiatives was Operation Stellar Wind.
Yes.
Which is kind of a cool name for an operation.
Yeah, because it means nothing. You can't tell anything about it.
See, the Navy does the same thing. When we did our air operation over Libya, we called it Operation Odyssey Dawn. But Stellar Wind sounds good, and Odyssey Dawn sounds like something a little girl would name her pink imaginary unicorn friend, you know. But anyway, Stellar Wind.
Stellar Wind, yeah.
Now, this is what Edward Snowden revealed later.
You know, in a form. So, all right, let's go to the fine print.
Okay, I think we should. I mean, this is the kind of surveillance Frank Church was warning us about.
This is the stuff. All right, this is why it's not easy. So one of the things I did, probably a little afternoon on September 11th. I know you all following along with current events, and you know this, Susan Rice and U.S. names and minimizing U.S. names and then unmasking U.S. names. You're all, I usually have to spend a lot of time explaining that. I don't have to do that now, okay? NSA suppresses U.S. identities when they show up to, from, or about a communication to protect your privacy. Unless, of course, the U.S. identity becomes critical to the intelligence. And all I did in the afternoon, early afternoon of September 11th, I just simply said, when we're deciding to minimize names for communications between Afghanistan and the United States of America, get a little more liberal, get a little more leaning forward in pushing the U.S. identity name. I mean, it's always a judgment, you know, and NSA is actually notoriously conservative about not putting the American name in there in the first place. And I'm saying, hey, I got 3,000 dead countrymen, I don't know what more is coming, and my enemy headquarters is in that other country. And they are communicating here to the U.S. So lean a little more forward. I didn't say expose them all. I'm just saying when you're making that value judgment, err over here rather than back here. So I called George Tenet, told him. I actually called the committees, back to Church Pike, the committees that Church Pike formed. I called and said, hey, I'm doing a little different here on that. Happy to come down and talk to you. The Senate guy said, no, you're great. The House folks said, sure, come on, explain it. And I did. That was fine. But I told George Tenet. So George, in his morning update to President and Vice President, to President Bush, Vice President Cheney, you know, he goes in there with I'm doing this, I'm doing this, and I'm doing this. It's pretty soon after 9/11. And the way that George tells the story, he then says, oh yeah, one more thing. Mike Hayden, the guy at NSA, yeah, he's going to jail. Okay. Again, echoing the limits of Church Pike, the great concerns. And the Vice President goes, tell him we got money, we'll bail him out. And the President said, what's he doing? And frankly, George said, it has to do with U.S. names. He's fine, but I just want to let you know he's leaning forward too. And President Bush then says, good. Anything else he could be doing? And George goes, I'll ask. So he gets back to Langley. He calls me up. He goes, I'm President, Vice President, going to jail, bail you out, so on and so forth. And the President then said, is there anything more you could be doing? And I said, George, no, not within my current authorities. And he, a little pause, and he goes, not exactly what I asked you, is it? Is there more you could do if you had the authority? And I go, I'll get back to you. So we huddled up at Fort Meade. It was our lawyers and our ops guys, If we had the authority, what more could we do? And we actually came up with, broadly, Stephen, 3 baskets of stuff, okay? And we developed it. I talked to George about it, and you know, about 4 days later, I'm in the Oval saying, well, Mr. President, if we had the authority, we would do these things. Now, I'm not going to, there's a fair amount of fine print in the book about what the 3 were. I'm not just, in essence, what had happened on 9/11, what pre-9/11, this is actually Church Pike stuff too. We Americans were trying to have 2 things in full measure that life doesn't let you get in full measure. Liberty, security, privacy, safety. All right? And we're trying to, where's the fulcrum? Where's the balance? In one of our techniques was, we're going to have these big, powerful intel guys, the ones Church Pike hyperventilated about. Intel over here, really substantial authorities, look outward, foreign. Intel, foreign. Law enforcement, over here, domestic, much more limited. Okay? See that? Foreign, intel, domestic, law enforcement. And where those 19 guys came in from? Right here. Right in that gap between the 2. And so the challenge was now, how do we close a gap that we had created consciously as a way to ensure we wouldn't overreach, that these agencies wouldn't do what they were intended to do. And so the Stellar Wind program was a basket of 3 baskets of things that would make us more capable of detecting a foreign enemy who may be physically in the United States, or at least whose communications would be in the United States. And we put those 3 things together. President approved it. I briefed Congress on it about 3 weeks after that. A small number, not not the big group. We briefed the FISA court on it. We launched it in October, briefed Congress, I think, right before the end of October, briefed the FISA court by January, and it went forward. There's a lot in the book. It's turbulent. We argued with ourselves and so on. I get all that. I'll just stop this chapter by simply saying, and when and there were changes to it, some laws were changed to make it easier, but when Senator Barack Obama, who had run to become President of the United States on a platform that I'm not George Bush, when he was briefed on the program as it then existed at the end of the Bush administration, said all ahead full. And it was President Obama's version of this program that Snowden then made public. And so my sense in that Church Pike, are you doing this right? Are you sure you're not abusing it? When you have two presidents who were fundamentally as different as those two, both fundamentally saying, no, this is the right balance. Yeah, we probably had it right.
One of the things that struck me from the book was that when you were looking at the information about who called whom, when, and for how long, basically information that you gathered from the phone bills of Americans, whether they subscribed to T-Mobile or some other. One of the things you did not do was apply the kind of algorithm and data mining that you could to find patterns in those phone bills of many large numbers of people. And to me, that's amazing because it indicates that the NSA was way behind Google AdSense, because AdSense does that to me all the time. I keep bees, so I look on the web for beekeeping stuff, and then the next time I read the New York Times, there's the beekeeping ads. They knew. Why weren't you doing that? You're supposed to keep me safe.
Yeah, so what Stephen's referring to is one of the baskets, and the one that really became very publicly known was called the 215 program, because it was, I did it on raw presidential authority. Congress later passed a law. This was section 215 of the law. It's, in essence, that metadata program, fact of call. A called B at that time for that long. It's fundamentally, for the old folks in here, it's what the phone bills used to look like. Okay? The young folks, they don't charge by the call anymore, but you all know what I mean, right? And so the company kept those records to get your money, all right? And on October 2nd, when I got this permission from the president, I just went to the company and said, give me that stuff. And they did. And so we built up a massive database simply of calls. I mean, no content, no, physically impossible to get content. I mean, you can't put an alligator clip on your phone bill and get the content of a call, all right? And so, but it's trillions over time of call events, either within the United States or from the United States and abroad. And what we did with, by the way, that could be scary. I think Frank Church would have been scared of that.
I think so.
Okay? All right? But then again, we're under different circumstances. All right? So now the question is, all right, so what are you doing with it? All right? And what we allowed ourselves to do, and only this, was, it's best explained through an example. So let's assume we got this gajillion call record database, and we roll up a safe house in, say, Yemen. All right? And we go through the safe house, and we get some folks, and they've got what's called pocket litter, you know, the kind of incriminating documentation, and one of these. So now, ooh, that looks like a very bad man. And this is probably a very bad phone. And I wonder if this phone has ever been in contact with the American homeland. Remember, gap here, how do we defend against the foreign attack whose communications or whose actors might be in America? So what we would do, this sounds like a cartoon, but it's what we would do. We kind of walk up to the doorway of that gajillion record phone base and say, hey, anybody in here talk to this here phone? And, you know, and the algorithm then would search very rapidly. And then if we get some phone in the Bronx, it would say, well, yeah, I talk to that phone every Thursday. Because we had the database, we could then say, well, who do you talk to? Stephen, I'm done. That's it. That's all we ever did with that. Now, Stephen's referring to something different, that you can do a lot more with that data. I was telling him before we came here, I was out of government, This is after Snowden and the 215 programs out there, and a lot of people were going, my God, what were they doing? We're on a panel out at Aspen. It's me and Keith Alexander, a couple other folks, and Eric Schmidt from Google, okay? And so we're talking about this, and Eric, Google guy, Alphabet guy now, I guess, right? He comes out and says, oh man, metadata is really, really powerful. You could use metadata, and he starts just rattling off how Google uses metadata. You can launch algorithms against it. You can divine patterns. You can predict behavior. So on, go on and on and on. And Alexander and I wait till he's done and go, Eric's right. We don't do any of that, but he's right. In other words, we don't do to the data that American business does to similar data. It could. It actually could yield useful information. But remember, we're back here, and the game is how much is enough? How much are you comfortable with? How much of your privacy and liberty do you want to give up for another pound of safety? Okay? And although you all freely let Google do it and let them violate your privacy, violate in quotes, all right? Google can't put you in jail. The American government can. And therefore, we were quite comfortable that no, we've got this narrow need. That's a useful tool. We will use it for that. We never even asked to try to do the other stuff.
We need to keep leapfrogging forward through this very interesting book because there are many topics to talk about. One of them is targeted killing, which has one of the most candid chapters on that topic that I've read, and it's one that I teach about at the Academy, so I read as much as I can. But this 18th chapter really starts in an interesting way, so I thought I'd ask the General to read the opening passage.
Sure. So it's a narrative, all right? It's the only part of the memoir that looks like a dialogue, because it was, right? And we're not talking about time or place or date or even who the actors are, all right? But it goes, are you sure they're there? The one who will make the decision asks. Yes, sir. And you're sure it's them? We've got good human intelligence. We've been tracking with streaming video. That's the predator. SIGINT, the NSA stuff. SIGINT's checking in now and confirming it's them. They're there. How long have you had capture of the target? And who else is around? In other words, how long have you been taking pictures of the compound? A couple hours. The family over here in the main building. The guys we want, they're in the big guest house here. They're not very far apart. No, sir, but far enough, far enough. And there's another outbuilding over here, small. In the past, we've seen AQ, Al-Qaeda. In the past, we've seen Al-Qaeda people use it when they stop here. We're here a lot, so are they. It's a really dirty compound. Anyone in that little building now? Don't know. Probably not. We haven't seen anyone since the predator. We haven't seen anyone since the Pred got capture of the target. What's the PK? Probability of kill. What's the PK on the big guest house look like with a GBU? It's a GBU-12. It's a laser-guided 500-pound bomb. The guys are dead. We think the family's okay. You think they're okay. Remember, they're reasonably close. They should be. We've done the bug splat. That is the irreverent reference we have to what are the physics of that bomb hitting this building look like. And what you come out with is a splotch of red, yellow, and green, which is not concentric because of the physics of the target, the thickness of the walls. So guess what it looks like? It looks like a bug splat, okay? So we've done the bug splat. But you can never be sure, structural weakness, they walk out of the house or something. All right, so what's it look like with a couple of Hellfires? Now, that's a much smaller weapon, 20-pound warhead. 20-pound versus 500. Well, we'd bring them in this way, all the energy away from the family quarters. So the family quarters are fine. If we hit the right room in the guest house, we'll get all the bad guys, but these internal walls, they can be thick, and if we don't hit the right room, or if one of them's up taking a piss, then there's a long pause in the room. Finally, the one responsible for the decision speaks. Use the Hellfires, small ones. Use the hellfires the way you said. An officer leaves the room en route to the ops center with that message. There's another long pause. Tell me about these guys again. Sir, big al-Qaeda operators, and they go through the history and the names. We've been trying to track them forever. They're really careful. They've been hard to find. They're involved in homeland plotting. They're the first team. They sure as hell have a track record. Another pause. Use the GBU. Another more senior operator jumps from the table, sprints after the first one. And that small building over here you said they sometimes use as a dorm? Yes, sir. After the GBU hits, if military-age males come out, yes, sir, kill them. Yes, sir. Less than an hour later, the decision maker is briefed again. Sir, 2 targets are dead. There was no damage to the family quarters, but they all left the compound. They were pretty upset. They left quick. No effort to see if there were any survivors in the guest house. No one came out of the small building. We didn't hit it. Thanks. That is the burden that the people who operate on your behalf accept in order to make the kinds of decisions that they hope and pray reflect your values. That they are represented, not just defending you, they are representing you. So the line I use when people talk about the folks who make these kinds of decisions is don't think of them as alien beings. They went to school with you, they go to church with you, and if you live here or where I live in Northern Virginia, you probably know a lot of them. Okay? And they don't have a different value system. They are required, however, to apply our common values in circumstances you will almost certainly never face and very likely will never learn about. And that's why I wrote that way.
I've been trying to ratchet up a bit here as we go through things that I think concern all of us, and we start with surveillance of phone metadata. At least we kind of passed over internet and content surveillance. I'm pretty sure it'll come up in the question and answer. We'll leave a half hour. But then there's also targeted killing, which we've just touched on. I hope that'll come up again. But your 12th chapter is about enhanced interrogation, a phrase that I despise, really. I understand its importance, but you describe how you revised practices to rule out certain methods, etc.
Yeah, so you're getting the impression that I got my fingerprints on every controversial program we've had since 9/11, all right?
Pretty much.
Yeah, and that's why the book.
Yeah.
So I started the surveillance program. There's that chapter I just read, the beginning to, talks about how CIA pushed President Bush to ratchet up the targeted killing program dramatically in 2008. And again, at the change in administrations, the new administration put its arm around that program as well and went forward. So I started the surveillance program. I certainly tried to amplify the targeted killing program. I inherited the program that Stephen just talked about, renditions, detentions, interrogations. This is the CIA black site stuff. And I came to CIA in May of 2006, and this program was the 600-pound quadruped in the middle of the room, all right? And we had to do something about this program. So I spent the summer of '06 trying to learn about it. And by August, I was prepared to started with Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor, up through the Vice President and the President, that we got to make some changes. And this was not my being judgmental about what George Tenet and Porter Goss, my predecessors, had done. It was just simply they had their circumstances, I had mine. By 2006, we had more penetrations of al-Qaeda, we knew more about the organization, and most importantly, we had a pretty good sense of the threat level of what it was they could do to us. And so extreme measures that, frankly, I agree were justified earlier were no longer as required. And therefore, for both reasons of ethics and, frankly, for operational reasons, we could pull back a bit on what had been an extremely aggressive program. So I went to the President and said, I don't want to close the black sites, but I do want to empty them. I want to keep them open because I'm figuring I may have to put some people in there. And I did. I put a couple in later. But, Mr. President, we're not the nation's jailers. We're your intel service. So we shouldn't be keeping people forever. All right? And although I can't claim that the intel value of everyone we still have is 0, there are other factors now that are probably more important than whatever residual intel value is left. So I want to empty the sites, keep them open, but empty them. We got to tell a whole bunch more people in Congress what we're doing. We met the law. George had actually briefed what's called the Gang of 8, which is the chair and ranking of the committees and so on. By the way, to give you a sense, when George started it, all right, he started it in August of '02. Congress was out of town. They didn't come back until September. George sends his folks down to brief them on what we freely admit is a very aggressive program. So George is kind of, pins and needles. What's Congress going to think? All right, and he sends his team down. They brief the Gang of 8. The team comes back. They come up to the 8th deck at Langley. George is kind of all agog. How'd it go? How'd it go? And the first response was, well, you won't believe it. And the way George tells the story, his heart kind of sank. All right, you won't believe it. The only question we got was, are you sure that's enough? Was what we got from the congressman. So this is not Pike's nightmare or Church's nightmare of an agency out there unbeknownst and renegade. We can all argue whether that was a good or a bad idea, but there are other people in the circle. So I said to the president, we don't have to keep all the people we have. We can ship them to Guantanamo. I want to keep the sites open. We need to tell more people in Congress. Frankly, Mr. President, you need to make it public. You ought to give a speech. And the 13 techniques we had, including waterboarding, we can probably slice them down to about 6 or 7. And at the end of the day, we got it to 6. Now, I'll probably burn in purgatory for this based on my Catholic upbringing. But 4 of the 6 I retained, I will swear to you, I had been subjected to by the Sisters of Mercy in Catholic grade school. Okay. Hey, people agreeing here, yeah. I don't mean to make light of it, but 4 of the 6 were grabbing them by the lapel, grabbing them by the chin, slapping them in the face, or slapping them with the back of the hand in the stomach. But all cards up, the other 2 were tough. Okay, one was a liquid diet of liquid Ensure, 1,400 calories a day. I'm seeing a face over here. Yeah, this is probably not going to be part of an ad campaign for Ensure, right? Yes, we were one of the enhanced interrogation techniques in the Central Intelligence Agency. Carefully monitored, but liquid diet. And then the other one was actually sleep deprivation, and it was at 96 hours to start with. All right. And the idea was not to punish anybody. Okay. The idea was to get someone we thought had life-saving information out of a zone of defiance into a zone of cooperation. We frankly wanted, we talked about this a minute before we came in, Stephen. We wanted to establish psychological domination over this person in order to learn what that person had. Later in the last presidential campaign, one of the candidates, now president, said that, and we're going to do waterboarding and a lot more because they deserve it. And that is incredibly off-putting for folks who actually had any hand in this. We didn't do any of this because they deserved it. We did it because it was absolutely essential, we believed, to keep Americans alive. And we're going to do waterboarding and a lot more because they deserve it, reflects a degree of enthusiasm for it. We were never enthusiastic for it. This was always done with regret. This was not something that George Tenet had in his lower right-hand desk drawer saying, boy, I hope something happens someday so we can use this program we developed.
No, certainly not, but I need to push back a little bit at this point. First off, on the record, Key School does not do any of those things. Okay. This is not like St. Peter's Elementary School. But second, since when I talk to the midshipmen about this, it could be hard to talk about our country. We sometimes talk about Israel as another democracy, even more beset by terrorism than the U.S. And there's a case study that is entirely factual. I've worked on it carefully and sourced it carefully. And it describes what happened when the Israeli head of the Shin Bet, their secret police, was trying to make to defend the Israeli people against the real danger of bombs in pizzerias, in buses, and so on. So the head of the Shin Bet actually called a press conference. Under Israeli press law, his identity can't be revealed in print, much less that he should call a press conference. But what he was doing was he had invited the families of people who had been killed aboard a bus by a bomb to apologize to those families and to say, I had in custody 72 hours before the event the person who built that bomb. And then he said, it's my fault. I should have questioned him more forcefully, but the reason I didn't was that man over there, and he points to Ben Yair, who was the Attorney General. And he's pinning on the Attorney General, invited to a bit of an ambush press conference, the fact that the law had constrained him. Now, the law in Israel was much more publicly arrived at than the standards that General Hayden had to abide by. Those standards were produced out of some very brief sessions with the Office of Legal Counsel, where the authorization from the President arrived at a person where only two people, at a meeting where only two people were present. It was a lunch with Vice President Cheney, and Vice President Cheney got the President to sign. In Israel, it was much different. There were hearings, and they got a justice named Landau, who was rather a grand figure in the history of Israel. He was the one who tried Eichmann when Eichmann, architect of the final solution, was kidnapped in Argentina and brought back to Israel and tried and hanged. Hannah Arendt describes it. Well, what Landau said very clearly was we will have one technique. We'll call it tiltulim, which is the same word for rocking a cradle in Hebrew. You can rock a person, you can shake them, not by the lapels even, because that's too much whiplash. You can hold their shoulders only. And the only time you can do this is when you have a suspect in custody where you have a moral certainty that that person has the information that you need, and a moral certainty that there is a bomb plot underway. It's a ticking bomb, very rare event, so that you could interrupt the ticking bomb and save lives. The only time you enhance your techniques, as it were. And then in the question and answer that followed, Yaakov Peri, unbelievably for a man so trained in the keeping of information, was asked, what about this? Don't we hear that somebody, a Palestinian, who is in custody and subjected to this tiltulim actually died of it? Was shaken so severely that he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage? He died like shaken baby syndrome? What's going on here? And he said, this cannot be that unsafe a technique because we've used it in 8,000 cases and only had one death. And everybody said, 8,000? 8,000 ticking bomb? 8,000 ticking bomb cases? That's more episodes than there are of 24, you know, the Jack Bauer show. That's just not real world. And when it came out after further inquiry, it turned out they had actually employed tiltulim about 20,000 times, and about 8 people had died. So what I'm trying to say is not that, what I'm trying to say is that any organization is made of humans, and even the most professional, the Israelis are serious professionals, under serious supervision of an attorney general who evidently made Yaakov Peri very uncomfortable, after a very public debate from a very responsible justice. A lot of those elements were missing in our procedure. Even then, 20,000 times, and they weren't actually doing this to gather information. It would appear that what they were doing was kind of processing people who were guilty of being Palestinian and bearded and of military age, and that before they shook them, they would keep them for 17 days. That's how long they could hold them without charges. And putting them in very small boxes and chilling them and sweating them and leaving them in their own filth and subjecting them to loud music and keeping them from sleeping. So by the time they finally shook them, the people were very seriously broken down, enough so that they might flop like a doll. This happened in Israel. And the reason it didn't happen in the U.S. is...
Well, I can, well, not just me.
No, but...
I mean, I began with the premise of talking about these things, that these people in here are not alien beings. They reflect your values. They have to apply your values in very difficult circumstances, the kinds that you never face. So let me try to give you the comparable scale inside the CIA program. Depending on how you count, it's not like we lost anybody, it's just how you book them. Is someone a detainee, or is that just temporary transit as you move them to another country? The number of CIA folks we're talking about here, I mean CIA detainees, is between 100 and 120. So let me just go with a bigger number, 120, all right? Not 8,000 or 20,000, 120. Of the 120, fewer than a third had ever had any techniques used against them. So the number we're talking about here is probably 35. No one gets into this program unless we had reason to believe that they were what we call HVT, high value target, or HVD, high value detainee. So it's just not part of the roundup. And I don't know as much of the Israeli program as you obviously do, Stephen, but it looked like the program went like this the longer it went on. This program went like that. So it began, for example, with a bunch of battlefield captures in Afghanistan, where the agency was so ill-prepared and performed so badly that Director Tenet said, we got to get our act together here. We have got to get specific techniques, the ones approved by the Attorney General in the conversation you said. So the program goes from kind of county option under the stress of combat to no. There's a list of things, and only people who have been authorized to do these things get to do those things. And I already told you, we went from a universe of 13 techniques to a universe of 6 techniques. We went from a universe in which 8 members of Congress knew to all members of both intelligence committees knew. We went from a universe in which detention was indefinite to a universe in which I was keeping people 60 days. Now, I could extend it, but it was in 60-day increments rather than just indefinite detention. And to be even more fair, I mean, President Obama is given credit for ending this program, and honest men can differ, and we can talk about that afterwards if you like, but he's also given credit for stopping waterboarding. He didn't. George Bush did. George Bush in 2006 took waterboarding off the table, which is by far the harshest of the techniques. And before we get to 8,000 or 20,000, the total number of people waterboarded was 3. And the last person waterboarded was in March of 2003. Right? And so I get it. When you do things in secret, to even good people under stress, the wheels can start to fly off. And you talk to some members of the Senate, they will say that they did, but I do think an awful lot of folks at CIA believe that this didn't go this way, that it actually went that way and got more disciplined and more constricted, the more safe we felt we could make folks. If you're asking for a mistake, all right, it's kind of at the level of process and politics. If you're asking me to revisit this and say, what would you have done differently? I would have briefed more people in Congress about more stuff more early, all right? What happened was we briefed a very small number, and then when this always becomes public, all right? And when it became public, you had an awful lot of beating of breasts and rending of garments, all right? It's going to sound harsh, but it's not unfair. My sense is we then give members of the other political branch a bit of a hall pass that they can go ahead and either have real or feigned moral outrage once we've made everybody feel safe again, but they're spared the difficulty of the decision when everyone's scared. And so my approach, because I think it's both constitutional and consistent with Frank Church and smart. Go in there early. Tell them what you're doing. And in a sense, dare them to tell you not to do it when the future is uncertain and everyone has good reason to be afraid.
I was struck that in the book you describe in speaking to the NSA people that day, just 2 days after the September 11 attacks, or less than 48 hours, that their job will be, we will preserve American liberty and we'll do it by making Americans feel safe again.
Yep.
I like that you put, we will preserve American liberty first, and that you implied in the second half will do it by making Americans feel safe again. When Americans don't feel safe, they want more protection. They care less about liberty. Things can go
So you know, thank you. That's a very important point. I want to emphasize it because it kind of threads through the book. All right. We don't view ourselves as just protecting your safety. All right. We actually think what it is we're doing is protecting America's way of life. And I make the point in the book that frightened people don't make good Democrats or Republicans, small d, small r, all right? Start to get frightened. They don't mind gnawing on their neighbors' liberties and privacies. They get really good and scared. They start gnawing on their own. And so one of the reasons we did push back, you know, playing to the edge, right? Not unlawful, but using everything that law and policy said we could do and using it pretty aggressively, was not just that it kept you safe, but frankly that we knew if we failed again, if we had a second 9/11, all right? If some of you have gas about the Patriot Act, if you're a little concerned about renditions, if you're a little nervous about surveillance, I can't imagine what it was we would have done collectively if we would have had a second catastrophic failure. And so one of the items of conscience that we had was, as tough as these decisions were, if they were inside the line and they actually made a difference, you need both, you're almost duty-bound to go do them. I tell a story in the book. I told you I only had 2 detainees, right? But I did authorize techniques against one of them, a fellow named Mohammed Rahim, because we actually thought he knew where a bunch of senior al-Qaeda folks, very senior, were living. And he was tough. He wouldn't talk. And I remember sitting there with the order, you know, Catholic grade school, human dignity, with the order saying, do I want to subject another human being to enhanced interrogation? In this case, it was sleep deprivation that was the real thing I was authorizing. And now I wish for all the world that somebody else had to make that decision. All right? Now, I couldn't do violence to my personal conscience, but in addition to my personal conscience, I carried yours. Or at least I carried your well-being. You know? And so although I might wish that I didn't have to make that decision, a power higher than mine, pick your choice, 43rd President of the United States or a more higher power than that, had put me in that position to make that decision. And I could not make it indifferent to your safety. And I picked up the pen and I signed it. And I wasn't sure what that would mean to me or for me as a human being for the rest of my life. I tell the story in the book. The phone would ring in the middle of the night, and I knew I was going to make a decision. And I literally would say, before I picked up the phone, Hayden, think this one through. Whatever you decide on that phone call, you're going to live with for the rest of your life. And that is not an absolute invitation to be overly cautious, because if you make too many overly cautious decisions and something bad happens, you really, really have to live with that. So I'm sorry, there are too many first-person singular pronouns in the last couple of paragraphs. What I'm trying to describe for you is what these people do on your behalf. And they totally agree with somebody who says, I don't think I want you doing that. I don't want my, that's fine. All right, that's an honest argument. That just simply means we went to different high schools together, so to speak. All right, we share values, but that in no way should lead to the demonizing of the folks who took on these additional responsibilities. Nor should it allow these folks to demonize those who say, "I don't want you doing it."
We have about a half an hour left, just a little under. You must have a lot of questions, and we have a microphone right in the middle of the room there. If you'd like to move to the microphone.
Yes, General, my name is Mark Harper. I went to Catholic grade school, and I'm familiar with at least 6 of those methods. And some of them are more effective when used in combination. The holding ear while slapping was very effective. But it worked, and we've done pretty well. My question is, based on your experience and what you can tell us, after 9/11, with some of the methods that have changed before. Can you tell us if anything has been prevented that might have otherwise happened?
Oh, sure. I mean, with what this program delivered, this was the single greatest provider of information about al-Qaeda we had. Now, over time, we had fewer detainees. The ones we had were aging off. They had less current information. And I already told you we had more penetrations and we were learning things. 9/11 Commission report. Remember after 9/11 you had that, and they came out in 2004. 25% of the footnotes in the report are from, a bit masked, but they're from the CIA detention program. I will simply repeat what Barack Obama's CIA says. There was information from this program that contributed to our getting to Abbottabad. All right. Now it wasn't as tightly knit as you would have gleaned if you watched Zero Dark 30. Okay, but there was connective tissue between the two. I talked to Abu Zubaydah's interrogator, the first detainee, and she, all right, she says there still isn't a week that doesn't go by that she doesn't wish we still had control over these number of people to go back to them with a question. And that was the beauty of the program. You could keep going back again and again and play them off against one another. Look, all right, we didn't turn any of these people into Boy Scouts. They didn't all say, where do I get my visas in order to become Americans? But they had moved from a zone of total defiance to one where we could work with them. And then we could then play off one against the other. By the way, the most effective technique we had, bar none, in every case, was our knowledge. What put them most off balance was, so what were you doing in that hotel in Kuala Lumpur on the 3rd? They didn't know. And so, no, it had great value. Now, again, I have to say this. I can still live with the argument. I get it. I still don't want you doing it. That is an honorable position, okay, and one that people like me have to deeply respect. What's happened, okay? What's happened because this has become so controversial, all right? We have made it so politically dangerous and legally challenging to detain that we don't. We kill. Okay? Since I left government, I probably got more fingers on this hand than people that we've actually detained outside of battlefields like Iraq and Afghanistan. That might be a little bit of an overstatement, but it's now if you talk to the folks in President Obama's administration, they will tell you, no. If we could capture, we would capture. But the historical record is, look, bureaucracy. I'm figuring I'm talking to some people with some experience in government here. All right, I mean, you know how bureaucracies, particularly federal bureaucracies, work. If you make something over here politically dangerous and legally challenging, the system just starts, water starts running in this direction rather than that direction. So what we have done, frankly, because of the great controversy of this, and which Stephen's brought up, very, very real and serious issues, as a nation, we just have kind of gotten too skittish, and we're over here pulling the trigger, which is not immoral, just doesn't create much intelligence.
Thank you, General Hayden. I've been appreciated a lot of your public statements. And for the record, Stephen, as a peaceful parent, maybe enhanced interrogation might help with the homework. So,
I got you. We'll try that. They certainly deprive us of sleep, but that's them on us.
In all seriousness, I want to ask about the privacy advocates because, full disclosure, I work in television production. In order to do that, you have to give up, you go to the White House, State Department, whichever. You have to give up a certain amount of information to be able to do that. In the same way, Americans, we want a lot of conveniences. And so we sort of can't, like you saying, you can't sort of have them and have the security that you need, at the same time having freedoms without people being able to see things. My question to you is, I kind of feel like it's a bit of a myth, honestly, having this, being able to not have, being able to have this complete sort of privacy as much as we want to have it sometimes. And I'm wondering if you could expound on that, and because my view is that if you elect the people who you want, who share your values, just trust the system. And I know a lot of people don't agree with that, but I want to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So when something like this becomes news, all right, I already told you where I was born and raised. You know, it's 4 hours down the turnpike, and the guys in the old neighborhood like me enough. I've never bought an Orange City for 15 years. They just give it to me, all right? And their response is a little bit like yours, sir. Hey, Mikey, yeah, you can listen to all my phone calls all you want, no problem. Go right ahead. And my answer is, that's not a useful attitude, okay? That's not what we do, okay? And so, so we had all your phone bills, and we could have algorithmed them,
Yes.
but we don't. We didn't. A lot of Americans just simply, in the current distrust of government, simply don't want to trust the government with your phone bills. And that's why y'all actually changed the law last summer, and now NSA doesn't keep the phone bills. Phone companies keep them. NSA can still get them, but they're not keeping them. So for most of us in the business, no, we really do observe the rules. We do minimize, we do protect U.S. privacy. We don't unmask your name unless it's absolutely essential. So the argument was, hey, unmask my name all you want. I'm not ashamed of what I've done. Thanks, but it doesn't answer the church question. It doesn't answer the constitutional questions. I mean, look, we're all Americans. Okay, the DNA says distrust government. All right, that's, we had that Lockean ideal, but the guys who wrote the Constitution were Hobbesian. All right, they just trusted everybody, and so they built in a system of checks and balances so that so you did not have to depend on government goodwill for your liberties to remain relatively safe.
Well, one of the reasons Church was so exigent, I think, is that he had just had a refresher course from the founders, and he had seen a president just forced out of office, who had actually made enemies lists and gone after them by breaking into their psychiatrist's office, in Daniel Ellsberg's case, in order to get damaging information to discredit him.
Yep.
Now, my problem with that is, in those days, he had to have a black bag team to go break into the psychiatrist's office, but now, with the wonderful tools developed, nobody would have to do that. I think any clever cyber major at the Naval Academy could find out all of my medical records, all of my most personal emails with my wife. So I feel vulnerable, and I can't just have that much confidence.
Well, no, I get the vulnerability thing, all right? We all do and should, just because of the nature of the cyber domain. So church is reflecting a political culture and a political history for the West, and, all the Western democracies, in which all of our cultural attitudes to protect our privacy have been honed in an environment in which the only real threat to our privacy came from our government. We don't live there anymore. All right? The most serious threats to your privacy, the institutions that most frequently impinge upon your privacy, not your government. All right? If the government was popping up your ads, all right, but it's not. It's a commercial entity that is productizing your choices for commercial profit. And so, if you really want to get to the heart of the privacy question, we have to not only continue to defend ourselves against government intrusion, but now suddenly realize if we're giving up stuff, if we're giving up privacy, it's by and large not to the government. It's to these other institutions, which is a completely different discussion. So again, all of our cultural habits are designed to defend against this, and that's really not the engine that's squeezing your personal data.
General Hayden.
Hi.
I'm about a fifth of the way into playing to the edge, and I'm seeing the decision-making process sounds very interesting to me. Could you say how you use input from historians and case studies like we've heard about in your decision-making process, and if you can say how other senior leaders get that kind of input and use it?
Thank you. Thanks. So I've got a BA and an MA in history, all right, which kind of makes me odd running the National Security Agency, all right? All right. But I mean, I bring to the jobs who I am, and I do personally see things through historical lenses. All right. I actually think I tell this story in the book, but I'm going to repeat it, and if I don't, then You'll hear it here. I'm there watching a briefing in Europe in 1993, 94. War in Bosnia, all the Yugoslavia disintegrating, you know, what we thought was a comfortable civilization, harmonious, now goes medieval on us, right? And so I've got a Navy lieutenant in 03 briefing a 4-star. I'm a brigadier. Briefing a 4-star just on the fighting going on in Bosnia. There's fighting in a little town called Mostar, which is down the Neretva River south of Sarajevo. And he said, sir, there's a lot of fighting going around in Mostar. He kind of points to it on the map. And the general says to him, so who's up here? Who's fighting? He said, sir, it's the Croats and the Muslims. The Serbs were cleansed a long time ago. They're gone. Who's on the offensive? Croats. They got the upper hand? Yes, sir, they really do. They're outgunning them. The Bosniaks, the Muslims. How far are they going to go? He said, sir, they're going to go to the Neretva. Now, the Neretva is the river that goes right through the center of town. And the general says, okay, is that a good defensible line? Oh, yes, sir. The banks of that river drop off about 10, 15 meters right there in the center of town. It's a really good line to hold. Okay, thanks, son. Sir, but that's not why they'll stop there. Oh, really? Because in the great schism of Christendom in 1054, sir, the dividing line between Catholicism and Orthodoxy was the Neretva River. The Croats are Roman Catholics. They'll go to the Neretva and stop. That is great. God, could have kissed the lieutenant. What a great response. We Americans very often don't see things in that deep historical context. All right, so we go into places without an appreciation for the story. Our tendency is to roll up our sleeves, for which the rest of the world really thanks us because we are hardworking. Roll up our sleeves and say, what's the problem? When the better question is, what's the story? So I spent a lot of time in both the NSA and the CIA job trying to understand the history. Not just the history of the agency, which can be important, but the history of the target, so that I would have a richer view to share with the intelligence client. I do tell one story in the book, that after the failure of the Iraq WMD, National Intelligence Estimate, recall all that, we got it all wrong, we had a senior executive seminar that we were running. And the historians had actually come up with a really, really good case study in which the senior executives role-played the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which, in fact, NSA almost certainly misread some intercepts. There was incident 1 happened, incident 2 didn't. But we were misreading, just an honest mistake and a very tough job, misreading what we were intercepting from the Vietnamese. We thought there was a second attack underway. It was the second attack that created the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the authorization for war. Now, that didn't create the war. It was just the bumper sticker for the war, but it helped get us to war. And they wanted to use this very controversial and very edgy, because there was role-playing involved, in the senior executive class. And they sent me a note saying, can we do this? Is it okay? Because they were fearful it would pull forward and pull backward into the class, the Iraq NIE. And that people would, I don't know, use the Gulf of Tonkin thing as a metaphor for the Iraq NIE thing. And I said, no, do it. All right, it's real, it happened, we'll learn from our history, and if there's any carom shot because the two seem adjacent to one another, we'll live with it. So it's just who I am, my academic background. I depend a lot on history. Yeah.
Hi, General Hayden. Thank you for coming to Key School.
Thanks.
My question, I have 2 questions. One is, how do you personally feel as a U.S. citizen about the fact that Congress voted that your browser history could basically be sold, and if I could buy that as a journalist and do what I want with it? And then the second question is, fast forwarding to 2 nights ago, our military struck in Syria, and from my civilian point of view, it seemed like a sort of a mess. It didn't seem like it did a lot of good, although I saw you comment that you thought it was a good airstrike. So I'd like you to comment on that as well. And also, you know, wouldn't $100 million be better spent in humanitarian
Sure.
aid in Syria?
So,
Thank you.
very quickly on all three, yeah, I'm with you on the internet browsing thing. Okay, back to, it's not the government that scares me. It's the private sector that scares me in terms of giving up privacy. I was okay with the strike. I actually thought, and you know, if you've seen me on TV, you know I'm not a big fan of some things currently going on, but I do think that was righteous anger on the part of the president. I do think that was a moral judgment, and I do think there are second and third order effects that are probably positive by conducting that strike. And just at a technical level, it was awesome. I mean, you had 59 T-LAMs hitting right where they wanted to hit, minimal collateral damage, minimal loss of life. And the reason I thought it was more than just, you know, a symbolic slap, all right, is that the reality, this is what I said last night, which you probably heard on Anderson Cooper, is that there is actually a pretty delicate military equilibrium right now between Assad and the opposition. Now, he's got the upper hand because he's got the Russian Air Force flying as the Syrian Arab Air Force. You've got a lot of Iranians fighting with them. But it's a relatively delicate balance. And, you know, we just proved to him that we can ruin your balance here. I mean, 15 months ago, he was going down. And so, I mean, this was a regime survival question. He's got an equilibrium now. He's taken Aleppo. He's feeling good about life. But that strike just reminded him that we can actually take the tools of war away from him with pretty much impunity and put him back to where he was 15 months ago. So it's more than just a symbolic, you shouldn't use those weapons, which it was. It also was a lesson that, you know, you're in a more precarious position than you think, and we can tilt this. Totally agree. And so what I don't understand, and I actually wrote this, I didn't say it on TV yesterday, but I did write it. How can you have compassion over a baby writhing under sarin gas and not have compassion for a 3-year-old washing up on the shore of Turkey? How can you, and I say in the article, we let 10,000 Syrian refugees come into the country last year, okay? 85% of them were women and children, and the vetting time for all of them was 18 to 24 months. We know how to do this. And so I just don't understand. What I freely admit was genuine compassion here. I mean, why cannot that be extended to these other things?
Good afternoon. I have two questions. Number one, what compelled you to write this book? And number two, since the NSA and CIA operate under secrecy, where does the news media get its information?
Yeah. So to answer the first question, what compelled me to write this book? My wife. And her look, I always thought I wanted to, but you know, this comes late. I didn't write this going out the door. This gets published this gets published 7.5 years after I left government. All right, so I let the stuff kind of percolate for a long time before I started to write. So that was that. Look, there's constant, and my wife wanted me to write it for the grandkids because, you know, we played to the edge. This is controversial. They're going to read about Granddad. Here's the way Granddad thought about it, and now they have it. With regard to the news entity, I mean, this is a constant, permanent tension built into the document, yep. All right? Just like the Congress has tension with the executive, secrecy has tension with the First Amendment, all right? And so we each have an appropriate role to play. Well, when my public affairs guy would run into the office with the hair on fire and say, oh my God, can't believe the story they got now, call the editor, you got to stop them. I would call the editor and I would begin the conversation. Look, thanks for taking the call. Ms. Mike Hayden at CIA. I totally understand we both have a responsibility for American safety and American liberty. But I fear the way you're about to carry out your responsibility is going to make it more difficult for me to carry out mine. Can we talk? And we would have a conversation. And to a degree that surprises most people, that's a friendly conversation, and we generally get results. Now, we don't often get, oh, okay, I'll rip it up. But there are modifications to the story, or there are delays to the story. Occasionally there are agreements, okay, we won't go with this based upon what you told me, but if anybody else has got it, we will, and if anybody else comes sniffing around, you have to tell us. And if they do, we do. And they print the story. So you've got this continuous negotiation in which we're trying to minimize and they're trying to maximize. That's as good as it's ever going to get. It's just the necessary tension. And
I watch you often on Morning Joe.
Thank you. But it comes back to what Stephen said earlier that Church was trying to describe.
Exactly.
And so one of the oversight mechanisms is a free press, even when they're saying things that probably should legitimately remain secret.
I'm afraid that has to be the last question. I've been signaled by the production team. I have no further recommendation should be necessary, but I do recommend, in just the strongest terms, fascinating chapters on each of the subjects that we've discussed, and truly we haven't covered 20% of what's in the book. I also wanted to give the General a gift. The gift itself is trivial, a tiny little book, almost a handbook, but the book is not trivial at all. It's by Timothy Snyder, who some of you may know, a 20th century historian at Yale, and really kind of the ornament of the history department at that extraordinary history program. He's written on the history of the 20th century, and his first very well-known book was called Bloodlands, and it was the grim history of the lands between Stalin and Hitler, which was a crushing place to be. It's what Ukraine and other countries, Belarus, suffered. He has another book called Black Earth, which is equally grim, about blood and land. The same part of the world, same time. His book now is called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, which he wrote rapidly and is more or less giving away. I recommend it to all of you. But what he does is list 20 things you can do if you feel that it might be possible that what Church was warning against, that if an authoritarian did arrive in this country, what things should you do? And they're simple things. Contribute to good causes, turn off your screen, read books, talk to each other, go out in public, build things. But it's a very good book, and I know that General Hayden doesn't need to read it.
I'm going to just add, one of my proudest moments as an American intelligence officer, one of the brightest instances of American espionage, occurred about 2 weeks ago when the head of the federal police force, the FBI guy, Jim Comey, and the head of the nation's largest intelligence service, that's Mike Rogers up the highway at NSA, stood there in open session and honestly answered questions that contradicted statements by the chief executive. That they were asked in open session, and that they answered in open session, only in America.
And you've been listening to former NSA and CIA Director Michael Hayden. Now, in just a few minutes, more live coverage from the 15th Annual Annapolis Book Festival.